My name is Raisa Mäkipää, and I'm Vice President of IBFRA and Research Professor in Natural Resources Institute, Finland. I warmly welcome you to this webinar today, which is the second in a row organized by IBFRA. And the chair of this session is Aapo Rautiainen. Dr. Aapo Rautiainen is environmental economist, and his recent research topics include economics of forest-based climate change mitigation actions. And he's also a member of the IBFRA steering group, and we are really glad that he organized this meeting and host this meeting today. So Aapo, floor is yours. You are muted, so your mic.
No, I have my mic on.
Yes, yes.
Okay, I'll reshare my screen. Just a second.
Right, now we can see that well. And now your mic is muted again.
Okay, do you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so we finally get started. Welcome also on my part. This is the webinar on the economics of natural disturbances in forests, and it's organized by IBFRA. I won't take very long, but I will say a few words to introduce the association, and then talk about today's topic and introduce our speakers. I know you're all eager to get to the presentations, so I'll be quick. IBFRA is the International Boreal Forest Research Association, and the mission of IBFRA is to promote and coordinate research on boreal forests. And if you want to know more about the organization, you can go to our website, ibfra.org. One of the things that we do is every 2 years or so, we arrange a scientific conference on boreal forests. And it's a multidisciplinary conference, so it covers all kinds of research related to boreal forests. This year, we're glad to host it in Helsinki. The topic is climate resilient and sustainable forest management, so that's a fairly wide topic, and it can accommodate a lot of different kind of research. So if you're interested, you can still submit an abstract to our abstract call, and it's open until the end of January. But then we get to our webinar. And before I start, I'd like to say thanks to Sadiq Talha for organizing the technical part of the webinar. And of course, to our 3 invited speakers who made it possible. I really wanted to have these, specifically these 3 speakers, and I'm very happy that all of them said yes to my invitation. So today's event is a part of a larger webinar series leading up to the conference that we will have in the autumn here in Helsinki. And we will be having webinars once every month. The first one was in December, organized by Florian Kraxner in Jasa. And we have new events coming during the spring, so keep an eye out for them. Today, we'll be talking about the economics of natural disturbances. And there were certain specific criteria that were used in the selection of the speakers and the presentations. So first of all, I wanted to look at the economics aspect of natural disturbances. So there's a lot of literature published on natural disturbances, but only a fairly small fraction of that focuses on economic issues. So I wanted to make the webinar about that. Also, I wanted the presented papers to be new, so that it's not something that everybody is already familiar with. So all of them are published in the past few years. And lastly, I wanted, as this is the Boreal Forest Research Association, I wanted them to be relevant to boreal forests. And that's, of course, a fairly tough set of criteria, because the number of papers published in economics is fairly small on these disturbances. New papers, that sort of narrows it down even more. And boreal forests, that's an even stricter criterion. So what I wanted to do is I relaxed the criterion in the sense that the presentations don't necessarily have to focus on boreal forest, as long as the studied phenomena and the applied concepts are relevant in the boreal context. And that is true for all of the presentations we have here. Our first speaker today is Jasper Fuchs, and he comes from the University of Göttingen, and he'll be talking about adaptation strategies for spruce forests, the economic potential of bark beetle management and Douglas fir cultivation in future tree species portfolios. So, as many of us know, bark beetles are currently a nuisance in Central Europe, and the relevance to the boreal biome come from that in the future, when the climate changes, our conditions will start to be more similar to that, and then bark beetles might become a bigger issue here too. So in that sense, with climate change, the topic is very relevant to the boreal biome. Jasper is a research associate and a PhD student at the University of Göttingen, where he earlier received his master's degree. And his PhD topic has to do with the economic impacts of extreme weather events on European forestry and adaptation options through robust management strategies. Our second speaker today is Olli-Pekka Kuusela, and he'll be talking about modeling market level effects of disturbance risks in age-structured forests. And the topic is in a sense universal, as it's an analytical paper dealing with age-structured forests, so that applies to anywhere in the world where you have age-structured forests. But it's also relevant in the boreal context, as in the Nordic countries, a lot of the forests are indeed age-structured due to the history of forest management we've seen in the past 100 years or so. Olli-Pekka is a researcher at ETLA Economic Research in Helsinki. He received his PhD at Virginia Tech 10 years ago, and after that, he has worked at several places. Among those, before he came to ETLA, he was assistant professor at the Oregon State University in the States. And his current work focuses on green transition and climate change policies. And he has published on topics related to forest economics, environmental economics, risk management, and policy instrument design, among other things. Our final speaker today is Matthew Wibbenmeyer from Resources for the Future in Washington, and he'll be talking about distributional concerns related to wildfire management and the incidence of wildfire hazard in the US West. So again, we're dealing with a paper that comes from the temperate biome, but wildfires are also an issue in parts of the boreal biome. And I'm hoping to, based on this presentation, I'm hoping to sort of find ways to reflect on how this concepts applied in the study could be applied in the boreal context, although the ecological conditions differ. And in the boreal region, we also have large areas with fairly low population density, but that's also true in some parts of the temperate biome. There are fairly sparsely populated areas there. Matt received his PhD in economics from the University of California at Santa Barbara, and his research focuses on understanding climate impacts and climate change mitigation policies related to forests and the land use sector more generally, and with a special focus on wildfires, as is evident from today's presentation. I hope the presentations will spark vivid discussion. There's plenty of time reserved for discussion, questions and comments at the end of each presentation. So I'm hoping that we let our speakers first present their presentation and then we can move on to the discussion. But if you have questions in your mind during the presentations, you can always ask them in the chat, and then we'll return to them at the end of the presentation. We should be done in 2 hours, so that's depending on where you are. It's in Central Europe, it's 6 o'clock in the afternoon or in the evening. So that's all I have to say for now. So let's move on to our first presentation by Jasper Fuchs.
Thanks for the introduction, Abu. I'll share my screen.
Okay. So can you share your screen?
Okay, you should now see my screen.
Yeah, great.
Perfect. Okay, as Abu introduced, I'll focus on bug beetles here. It will be an example from central Germany, but I assume that it's well transferable, at least in the methods, to the boreal forests. So this is one of the pictures we actually have in Germany. In Germany, we planted large spruce forests after World War II for reforestation. And so we have quite large spruce monocultures. And we always had to deal with some endemic bug beetle disturbances, but in the last years, these disturbances severely increased, and we have these pictures. And from a German perspective, where we avoid large clear fellings, this is quite an unusual picture. And we have to say that it's still one of the nicer ones, since there's still some spruce that is living and green. So what happened is a huge increase of bug beetle disturbances. So I brought you here the harvest volumes in Germany over the last years. Here summed up for species. And the bars give us the salvage logging volumes. And we distinguish the salvage logging volumes by damage agent. And as you can see, we always had some endemic bug beetle in red here, but we have a strong increase since 2018. What happened were stormy events in 2018 and afterwards drought events, and the bug beetle populations increased to numbers we haven't known before. And this summed up to a loss of about 20% of the entire spruce volume in Germany. And the economic losses by these bug beetle events have been estimated for the years 2018 to 2020 to be about 12.7 billion euros, which is about 10 times the annual net profit of German forestry. So many German forest enterprises now have an immense problem, as spruce was one of the most important economical species here. But bug beetles may also be important in other regions in Europe. So there is this publication of Rupert Seidel predicting an increase in bug beetle disturbances from 1970 to 2021 of about 760%, so quite a large number, and seems to meet what we have seen. And if extreme events lead to synchronized bug beetle outbreaks, they may become also of supranational relevance, as written in one of the EFI publications. If you want to model bug beetle outbreaks and also possible adaptation strategies, it's not meaningful to focus only on bug beetle disturbances, since they always interact with storm events, and there are many publications. So our first idea was just we should consider all different disturbance agents. And then from an economic perspective, we often have models that focus on stand replacing disturbances events, and bark beetles, at least in the endemic phase, may occur several times per rotation. This was also something we wanted to include in our study. Yeah, and the main problem is, and it's something Apo already mentioned, there aren't many economic studies on bark beetle adaptation options or general on disturbances. And so we started to focus on adaptation options. And we started with 3 different adaptation options that are often discussed in Germany. One is adjusting the tree species composition. So we started with a spruce stand and thought about having also beech stands in our first enterprise. We refer here to block mixture. So we have 2 separate stands and the species do not interact. An alternative would be planting beech under spruce and having the idea that in the future we will have a mixed stand of these 2 quite different species, a broadleaf and a softwood species. And in mixed stands, we would assume that the species interact and stabilize each other against disturbance events. And the third option is adjusting the rotation period, so usually shortening the rotation period as the disturbance risks are higher at higher ages. And then we ask which of these adaptation options are able to compensate economic consequences of climate change on current spruce sites. Another management option often applied in the last years, at least in the beginning of the bark beetle outbreaks, was an intensive bark beetle management program. So we also wanted to consider this. The idea of this bark beetle management program is to decrease the risk of spruce in order to retain high shares of spruce as an economically attractive tree species in our species portfolio. Bark beetle management program here means that we have bark beetle monitoring, which is quite intensive, combined with timely sanitation fellings and chemical treatment of the logs after harvesting to prevent the beetles from spreading. And as this intensive bark beetle management program is related to costs, our idea was that we should consider another alternative, and we choose the introduction of a highly productive species as alternative to spruce. And here we choose Douglas fir. Douglas fir has wood properties that are mostly comparable to spruce or even better. It's also a softwood species. However, it's not native in Germany, and there are some discussions whether it's a good idea to introduce Douglas fir due to ecological reasons. And the general setup of our model approach is based on portfolio theory coming from stock markets, and here applied to tree species selection. So the conceptual idea is that if you combine different assets in a portfolio and these assets are not perfectly correlated, this reduces the economic risks in terms of fluctuation of the portfolio return or the portfolio value. And here we interpret the tree species as different assets and consider price fluctuations on the wood markets as well as biophysical risks. We then build up a tree species simulation and optimization model. They have several approaches been before on this. And this means we simulate the tree growth under stochastic disturbance and events and market fluctuations. And on top of this, we set an economic optimization from the perspective of a risk-averse decision maker. So let's have a quick overview of our model. So we are focused on the optimal species composition and the optimal set of management options that maximize the value at risk as objective function. I say more about this objective function later on. And this is influenced mainly by the biophysical variables related to climate change with bark beetle populations and infested volume and the tree species survival. Combined with growth, we get a simulation 1, and we can translate it into an economic value, here in annuities, so an annual return from first management. And additionally, we calculate the standard deviation of this annuity as a risk measure. Based on these two values, we can calculate the value at risk, our objective function. And our model then optimizes the tree species composition according to the value at risk under different management options. And these different management options are those introduced earlier, so adaptation of the rotation period, adapted species composition and selection, which includes the establishment of mixed stands as well as adding new species to the portfolio, and investing in an intensive bark beetle management. And we also simulated combinations of these options. We run our simulations for a stand in the Harz Mountains in central Germany. The Harz Mountains have been considered to be a natural area for spruce. So we have about 50% spruce in 2012 in the Harz Mountains according to our NFI. It's located at 550 meters above the sea level and has a mean annual temperature of 5.9 degrees. I think that's mostly the same as in Helsinki, but we have a higher precipitation sum with about 10,000 millimeters per year. And we compare two climate scenarios, so a current reference climate, which refers to 1975 according to the World Clim dataset, and a future climate, which is 2070 under the RCP 85 scenario. And this climate is main driver for our disturbance simulation. And disturbances are here firstly stand replacing disturbance events, so mainly abiotic storm events. And we calculated them based on the survival time models of Susanne Brandl, which have been derived from the ICP dataset, so an European-wide dataset. And they give us a survival probability of a stand until a given age. And here on the left side for monocultures. In the dashed line, you see the reference climate with Douglas fir, beech, and spruce. And the dotted lines under climate change, the survival probabilities are lower. And the models also consider the stabilizing effect of close mixture. So in mixed stands, here with a 50% share of the respective species, we have slightly higher survival probabilities. To compare the magnitude of the disturbance risk, we often use the S100, which is the survival probability until the age 100, and that will be important on the later slides. The survival models are functions of age, precipitation, temperature variables, and the species mixture. And then we added bark beetle infestations, and here it's possible that only parts of the stand are affected by this infestation. It's a two-step approach to estimate the bark beetle disturbances. So first we took a bark beetle model. It's an updated version of the Overbeck and Schmidt model, which gives us a probability of a bark beetle event, and then estimated the infested volume based on this assumed beta function, which is based on the ICP dataset. And as you can see, we assume that most times only parts of the stand are affected, while it's seldomly only the entire stand is affected by one single event. And simulating tree growth under these disturbances gives us a simulation one, which we translate into an economic value. Here, firstly, a land rent as annuity of the land expectation value, giving us the annual return. Since our model is a stochastic model, we repeated the simulation 10,000 times per scenario and received a distribution of this annuity. We then refer with return to the expected value of the annuity and with economic risk to the standard deviation of this annuity. However, a risk-averse decision maker would interpret risk most times as negative deviations from the standard deviation, from the expected annuity. So we focus on the left side of the distribution and maximize the value at risk as our objective function. which is the 5% quantile of the distribution. So the model searches for the portfolio composition, the composition of tree species that maximizes the minimum annuity we will receive in 95% of all cases. Coming to the results, we now have a risk-return diagram. So on the y-axis, we have the return as expected annuity, and on the x-axis, risk as the standard deviation of the annuity. And we started with an optimum block mixture portfolio of spruce and beech under current reference climate, which has an expected annuity of about 200 euro and about 57 euro per hectare and year for standard deviation. And simulating this monoculture of spruce under climate change gives a much lower expected annuity. And we are now searching for adaptation options that compensate for this adverse effect of climate change on the economic return. And our objective function is indicated by the shading in the background. So here in the dark gray part, this would be an adaptation option that has a negative effect on the value at risk. So the value at risk would be worse than the spruce monoculture without any adaptation. So no good choice from an economic point of view. Here in the middle, we would have a partial compensation of the adverse effect of climate change. And top left, we would even overcompensate the economic losses. We then introduce the mixed stance with 5% beech, which would be the optimal mixed stance under the reference climate. And under the future climate, we see that this would slightly reduce the economic risk. We re-optimize the tree species composition of spruce and beech in block mixtures, and the optimal stand is still the spruce monoculture, so no adaptation gain by this option. And we adapted the rotation period, so shortened the rotation period, which compensated for parts of this climate effect. We then introduced our intensive bark beetle monitoring, and this is quite nice direction since we get a higher return for a lower economic risk, but it compensates still only for minor parts of this climate effect. Then we force 30% beech into the model, and we see a quite large effect on the economic risk. So introducing another species is, from the perspective of economic risk, a really good idea. Here it's introduced in block mixtures, so the species still do not interact. And we see that this reduces the risk, but also the return in a magnitude that the value at risk is lower than that of the spruce monoculture. However, introducing 30% Douglas fir in block mixtures also reduces the economic risk, but for a higher return. So this is the best option from the perspective of value at risk from all those shown here. However, none of these single options was able to compensate for the entire adverse economic effect of climate change. And so we started to combine them. So we optimized the tree species composition in mixed stands. This leads to a stand with 30% beech in the spruce forest. And this is slightly better in the economic return than the block mixture. We then added adapted rotation periods and bark beetle management, but only if we also offered the model to introduce Douglas fir. It shows a quite high share of Douglas fir in the optimal mix stand, and combined with all these other options, is clearly overcompensated the economic effect of climate change. So we now have more or less the return we have in the current portfolio under the reference climate, also under the future climate, but for much lower economic risk. And this is plus minus also the same if we restrict the share of Douglas fir to 30%, which might be interesting from an ecological perspective. So we see that combining management options provide synergy effects, and these might be helpful to compensate the adverse effects of climate change. And introducing an alternative highly productive tree species is really promising and strongly decreases the economic risk. We then wanted to understand why our bark beetle management is not so attractive from an economic perspective. And we also have to admit that it was quite hard to find values on the effectiveness and costs of this bark beetle management. So we ran this sensitivity analysis. Now we have the value at risk on the y-axis, and the dashed line is the current reference, so the monoculture before climate change, and then the no adaptation scenario of this monoculture on the dotted line. So between the lines is this adverse economic effect of climate change we want to compensate. On the x-axis, we have the effectiveness of bark beetle management, which is here the reduction in infested volume. And in our baseline scenario shown on the previous slide, screen point, we assumed costs of 30 euro per hectare in the year and a reduction in infested volume by 40%. We see if the effectiveness is lower or the costs are higher, we have no adaptation gain by this strategy. However, if remote sensing would decrease the costs, bark beetle management might be a more attractive option to adapt forests to climate change. But one has to consider that the reduction of 30% in infested volume is already quite optimistic if compared to the simulation studies of Laura Dobor et al. So bark beetle management is only economically attractive if a high effectiveness can be achieved at low costs. And then we try to understand why introducing Douglas fir is so attractive. So Douglas fir is more productive than spruce, than spruce and also than beech. So this is one part, but then we also focused on the timber price. Now we have the value at risk on the y-axis as before, and now we have the relative timber price of Douglas fir on the x-axis. And this is more or less the timber price of spruce. And the background colors give us the optimal tree species portfolio of a mixed stand with beech, spruce, and Douglas fir under these different timber prices of Douglas fir. And since it's a mixed stand, we see that it's always a good idea to combine spruce with another species, which might be beech, or if Douglas fir prices are high, Douglas fir. And we see if we reduce the price of Douglas fir from our baseline scenario to 70% of the current prices of Douglas fir, the model starts to select beech instead of Douglas fir. So wood prices seem to be important. And introducing an alternative tree species is a good idea in mixed stands, but it's especially economically attractive when the expected timber prices are high. Now one can say that Douglas fir is an introduced species in Germany. So in the future, disturbance risk may change as we might also introduce specified pests. And so we also run a sensitivity analysis of a survival probability of Douglas fir. Here it's this S100, so the probability that the stand reaches age 100. In our climate change scenario, this probability is about 70% in a mixed stand. And then we see that we can reduce this probability down to 40%. So the probability of Douglas fir to reach the age 100 is 40%, and we still compensate the entire adverse economic effect of climate change. And beech gets only attractive at really low survival probabilities of Douglas fir. So introducing Douglas fir provides a considerable adaptation gain, even if disturbance risk increase. However, we see that the optimal proportion of Douglas fir decreases when the risk of the species increases. So let's come to some limitations of our studies, so only the most important ones. One is that these survival models are based on data until 2017. So these large calamities seen in 2018 and later are not included. So maybe we underestimate this climate effect. And drought events are probably underestimated since they played a minor role in the years before 2018. However, beach is also affected by drought events, so one could assume that our species mixture would be stable, but we might not compensate for the entire adverse effect of climate change. Then the survival models do not account for the species identity for the stabilizing effect of species mixture. So admixing beech to spruce has the same stabilizing effect on spruce as mixing Douglas fir. However, one could assume that species that are more different, so broadleafed and a softwood species, have a stronger effect stabilizing against future risks. And our study focused only on income from wood production, maybe accepting that trees die, and do not account for carbon sequestration or other ecosystem services. Let's summarize some conclusions. So we have seen that combinations of management options are quite promising to adapt to climate change. Then the time point of stand establishment seems to be quite important for a proactive adaptation to climate change, as planting diversified mixed stands has a strong effect on the economic risks. However, from an economic perspective, the return is also important, and there it would be good to include highly productive species with high expected timber prices in these diversified mixed stands. And I think this method is well transferable to other pests, regions, and species. So I hope this is also from interest for the boreal community. Currently, we are working on an enterprise scale model where we focus on allocation problems under site heterogeneity to solve the question which species to plant where. And there we also introduce spatially correlated extreme weather events, since it may be important for a forest enterprise whether only one stand is affected or the entire enterprise, as we often have in Germany at the moment. And from an economic perspective, you have other problems than such as liquidity problems and so on. And as a fund potential project with Luke, where we are working in, we also want to introduce structural diversity, so compare age class versus continuous cover management as an additional option to diversify the future stands. I will thank you for your attention and letting us present our studies here, and thanks to my co-authors.
Okay, thank you, Jasper. Great presentation. Now, if anyone has questions, we can open the floor to discussion. So if you want to ask something, just raise a hand, or if there's no one speaking, then just, you can open your mic and start talking. Well, maybe while we're still thinking, I'll ask about the Douglas fir. So do you, at the moment, how much Douglas fir do you have in Germany? Have there been tests with the species in Germany, or is it just a sort of new idea of introducing it?
I'm not quite sure about the share of Douglas fir. I think we have about 4%.
Okay,
but we have experience with it in small stands since several years. So.
Okay, and it appears to grow well in German conditions, and there's no problem sort of establishing stands with Douglas fir.
So there are some problems in the establishment phase. So usually you have to replant parts of the stand, but once it's growing, it's a really fast growing species and quite good wood production.
Okay, yeah. Because I think there was just recently, the reason why I'm asking is that recently there was some discussion in Finland that probably in Finnish conditions, you might have trouble establishing the stands because of the sort of cold winters. But I think we now have some hands. So I'll give the first turn to Matt. So Matt, if you want to open your mic, feel free.
Hi, Jasper. Great presentation. So I was I wanted to make sure that if I understood you correctly, that when you're modeling the disturbance risk, you were modeling stand replacing disturbances for single stands, and I was wondering, I was wondering particularly about thinking about fire. You can think about a disturbance in one stand actually impacting, so for example, a beetle infestation might actually affect the risk for a neighboring stand. So in other words, there wouldn't be this independence assumption about the risk across stands would be violated. And so I was just wondering if you thought about that, if my understanding of this is correct, and if how that would influence your results.
Mm-hmm. So good question. So we have stand replacing disturbance events and these partial infestations by bug beetles. In partial infestations, we have a timely autocorrelation in it, but you're totally right, we don't have the interaction between neighboring stands. And that's the reason why our next step was this enterprise model where we tried to introduce correlations between stands and these correlated extreme events.
Great, thank you.
Okay, the next question goes to Raisa. Please go ahead.
Yes, and thank you for the excellent presentation. This was really, really interesting, and you almost answered my question in your second last slide. You discussed about future research questions and mentioned the continuous cover forestry. Is it straightforward to address that question with your tools, or what is the major challenge? I'm curious to know how long it takes to have results on potential of the continuous cover forestry, and how well you cope with the tree level stress and assumption whether the stress is increased by selection harvesting or decreased. So this is my thinking here. But anyhow, how straightforward is it to apply this approach to continuous cover forestry and get results?
So our idea is to not simulate species portfolios, but stand type portfolios. So then we have an optimal mixture of stand types, and one stand type might be an H-class spruce forest or, for example, a continuous cover spruce forest. The main problem was that we here started with yield tables, so quite simple growth simulations, and we need a good growth simulator for continuous cover management to be included here. And then it depends on the disturbance functions that are available that you can introduce in this growth simulation. And it has to be quite performant, as we have to run these 10,000 repetitions. That's often the limitation and the reason why we try to keep the disturbance module as simple as possible. So matrix models might be quite easy to integrate, where you have a disturbance probability in this matrix, but real single tree models are usually not performant enough for our Monte Carlo simulations. But we hope that we will have results in the project within the next 1.5 years.
Thank you.
Okay, so I fell off. Is everyone still here?
Yes, we are.
Yeah, okay. Sorry for that. I think it's time for our next presentation. So Olli-Pekka, if you can share your screen. And thanks once again to Jasper for a great presentation.
Yeah, and thanks for the opportunity.
Hello, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
And the audio is working well?
Yes, please go ahead.
Good. Well, thank you, Jasper, for a very interesting presentation as well. And thank you for Aapo for organizing this event and for the invitation to come and give this presentation. So the title of my presentation today is Modeling Market Level Effects of Disturbance Risks in Age-Structured Forests. And this is a collaboration with Jussi Lintunen. And we conducted this research 2 or 3 years ago. So it's always a fun experience to travel back in time to see the type of research that you were doing back then. So it was, of course, a fun experience. So Back to the Future now. So let's see. Okay, here we go. So here's the outline of my presentation. So I'm gonna first give some background, provide some background about what's going on in the in the boreal forests, to tie my presentation maybe to a bit more concrete terms into boreal forests. Then I'll provide introduction motivation of our research. I'll present our model, market level model with 2 age classes, and then some numerical solutions and simulations from our model, and some conclusions and research at the end of the presentation. So hopefully we'll make it all the way there. So as you probably know very well, since you are participating in this event, so of course disturbances are very like a normal part of boreal forests, the dynamics of boreal forests. So they can be called as disturbance-driven forests. Fires typically occur on a very large scale when they happen, especially the more severe fires. Also similarly with the insects and disease outbreaks. So here's a picture I found from the internet showing the fire perimeter in Canada when you look at the past 30 years or 40 years or so. And as you can see, a lot of the big swath of the area in Canada, a large part of the area has been touched by a fire of some severity. So this, of course, doesn't, I guess, take into consideration the degree of severity of the fire. And typically these fires, if we talk about fires here specifically, occur in these cycles of about 70 to 200 years in boreal forests. As we also know, and most likely, I don't know exactly what IPCC is saying about boreal forests, about the impact of climate change on these disturbance events, but it can be probably said that climate change is driving these trends. So we are experiencing more severe fire regimes and more fires in boreal forest than in the past. So this is, of course, a very worrying trend. And here I found some data that shows how tree cover losses have developed in the boreal forests. And as you can see, these losses of tree cover, of course, this doesn't translate to deforestation per se, because talking about boreal forest and not necessarily, not about tropical forests, but there's been this increase of a trend increasing tree cover losses. And of course, a lot of that trend can be explained by the big fires in Russia that has been happening in the boreal forests. And that's, of course, driven by dry conditions and warming climate and things like that. But of course, elsewhere in Alaska is another example where these increasing fire trend can be observed. Of course, if you look at the history going back further in the history, I mean, you can see from the data that, of course, these sort of like big fires have happened also in the past. So there are some other, of course, factors that have played part in explaining this sort of trend pattern here, where you have lower acres burned in the 60s and 70s, and then gradually increasing share of fires. But I'm sure Matt will maybe talk about this type of a thing in his presentation. Because fires are not the only disturbance agent in boreal forest or in any forest, like we learned from Jasper's presentation. So there are insects outbreaks, diseases, of course, snow, wind damages, and also wildlife damages. So all kinds of disturbance agents, and some bigger and some maybe less significant in terms of their aggregate level impacts. And here's one of my favorite photos I've taken myself from the Finnish Lapland, where you can see that there's been a wind throw event after actually like a thinning management that was conducted earlier in the year, and this occurred in the fall season. This wind throw damage. Okay, so large areas of forests are impacted by disturbances each year, but there's also considerable variation from year to year. So there are some years that are considerably worse in terms of let's say fire damages, and then other years when the acres or hectares burned can be a bit smaller. And this type of effects, of course, may cause, when they happen, significant welfare effects in timber markets for the market participants. So landowners, for example, or maybe the industry as well. Of course, it depends a lot of what kind of a impact it is, but nevertheless, we can say that there are some people who will lose, and maybe some entities that might actually gain from certain short-term impacts like the salvage harvesting and so on. And we know that there's some increasing frequency and intensity of these type of pulse disturbances, like they described, due to changing climate. Well, in economics, we of course use different kinds of models to try to understand these impacts on the markets. And Jasper just presented an interesting stand level model, whereas in our research, what we are doing is we're focusing on more like a forest or market level approach. And these type of models are useful in assessing and predicting the effects of these type of disturbances on market participants, and also on timber supply, and on the age class structure in the landscape or at the national level. But they are also useful for assessing the effects of disturbances on the design or on the outcomes of different types of forest policy. So as we know, there's a lot of discussion now about carbon sequestration in forests. Well, if we do that sort of a policy, we encourage landowners to extend rotation age. Well, what's the impact of this increasing risk of fires or fires just in general on these policy outcomes? So that's an interesting question. Also, biodiversity conservation is another topic that's of great interest right now, and definitely potential application for using these type of models to study the impacts of fires. So in these type of big models, the standard approach is to assume essentially that there is some known share of disturbed forest area in each period. So, but in reality, of course, like I just said, it can, the share of forest being disturbed in any given period, let's say 5-year period, can fluctuate by quite a lot. So the question that we are asking is how good of an approximation this type of a deterministic model, where you assume that certain share of forest is always being destroyed, is to a truly stochastic model. So how good can we capture the stochastic behavior and the optimal solution to a stochastic model by using this sort of like a simpler approach of using deterministic model. So essentially, our research is focusing on improving or developing modeling methodology. So we're not necessarily able to give you, very specific numbers for a specific region about the impacts of fires on market level, but we are essentially building tools that can be used for future research. So in our very simplified model, which is typically used in this type of forest economic studies, where you are exploring the theoretical or numerical aspects of some sort of model framework, is to assume that we have a simple setup with 2 age classes. Of course, this can be expanded to include more age classes, but to be able to derive certain conditions and characterize the model solutions, we start with the 2 age class model. So then we compare 2 ways of framing it. So we have model with rational expectations, so expectation operator and stochastic model, and then we have another model with perfect foresight and this sort of like a deterministic setup. And we ask the question, how closely does a policy function that's solved from the deterministic model approximate the policy function solved from the stochastic model? And if they are reasonably close to each other, or even almost the same, then that gives some justification for using this sort of like a deterministic setup for solving the model and then simulating the stochastic outcomes in the more realistic, bigger models that people actually use when conducting this analysis. So there's been quite a broad, several papers that have studied, of course, the presence of risks at the stand level to start with. So some early papers by Reed and his co-authors. And this original model that was developed by Reed has been then extended later on to include amenities, adaptation strategies, and carbon sequestration, and also this sort of like a sequential risk. So these are stand level models, and there's I think a rich literature on this topic. But of course, there could be more like Apo said earlier. Of course, there are also some forest level models that include risk, some early papers, but these typically use this sort of a deterministic approach. So you assume perfect foresight and this sort of like a known share that's being disturbed from the forests. But these models, another limitation of these earlier models is that they assume typically constant timber prices. So these could be maybe more readily called harvest scheduling models rather than market level models. But still, they provide a good starting point and exploration of this topic. Of course, there's another line of research and literature that analyzes these sort of like age class models with 2 age classes or maybe more that have this sort of like a market type of a setup. So this sort of a concave utility function, as we say, as we describe it in economics, but as the objective function. But these models don't include risk in the analysis. So the certainty equivalence, of course, is very well-known approach to solving these sort of like models with random quantities, and they've been developed and used in other areas of economics. So this is not just something that we do in forest economics, but in other settings of economics as well. And it's known that if the objective function is a quadratic function, then the certainty equivalence approach provides the same solution as the fully stochastic model. And even in more general settings, it can be shown that this certainty equivalence approach can provide at least a first order approximation for stochastic models. But still, it's kind of case specific how close the deterministic model actually is or the solution is to the stochastic model solution. So that's why we feel like we had an interesting research question here to explore. So in our model, we have 2 age classes, young and old. There's area allocated to each age classes, denoted here by this variable x, x1 and x2, and time is denoted by t. total area is fixed to equal 1. So the area in the young forest plus the area in the old forest sums up to be 1. There's a volume per hectare in old forest that we also set to be 1, but then the volume per hectare of young forest is something that's between 0 and 1. So there's less volume in young forest. So that's kind of course a very natural assumption to be made. So in each period, there can be a harvest from each of these age classes. And that's of course a question that is determined by the optimization routine and optimal solution, how much exactly is being harvested. And then we can denote the total harvest at time t by this capital H variable, which is the sum of these harvests from the two age classes. And then we have utility from consuming this total harvest. And I'll define that utility later, but essentially it's the market surplus, as when we call it the Marshallian surplus. So it's the sum of the producer surpluses and the consumer surpluses. So the landowner surplus and the industry surplus, let's say, that forms the utility. So it's not just something vaguely defined utility. So it's actually a surplus measure. To be able to characterize the model, we make these typical type of assumptions that are made in the theoretical literature about this topic. So we assume that there are no regeneration costs and no salvage. But these can be, of course, all relaxed and in future research, and we've done some of that already. But when it comes to the kind of like the essential insights that we are able to derive from this simplified model, I think these additional features don't really matter that much. But of course, they are important work for the future to be made. So here is the description of how the disturbances work in our model. So we have a portion theta of the forest that survives to the next period. So, and then consequently, as a result, portion 1 minus theta doesn't survive. So, and I'll show the dynamics soon, but that's essentially how we model the disturbance process. So these are independent, identically distributed shocks, and these shocks are realized after harvesting decisions are made. So here's a timeline that kind of shows the sequence of the events. So first harvesting decisions, then the realization of the shock, and then we have the areas in the next period in each young and in each of the age classes, young and old. So here is a kind of like a schematic description of the forest dynamics. So so starting from age class 1, so the young age class, they can be harvest age 1t time t. Then we have the survival shock. So what's the share of the forest that survives? And then 1 minus theta times then the area that was not harvested from the young age class is destroyed and returns back to the age class 1 in the next period. But then, of course, the share theta of this unharvested part of the young forest will survive to the next period and will become age class 2, old age class in the second period. Similarly, from that age class, you can harvest at time t. You have a survival shock, and then whatever you didn't harvest from the age class 2 either survives to stay in the age class 2 in the next period, or if it is destroyed by the fire, it will return back to become age class 1. And this is another, I guess, important feature of our model. So we don't make the assumption that the oldest age class must be harvested entirely at the in each period. So there's this potential case where not all of the forest in the second age class, in the old age class, is harvested, but will be left to stay in the second age class, in the old age class, in the subsequent period. And of course, like I said in the beginning, we could expand this by having multiple age classes, which is more realistic. But this is essentially the simplified model setup that we have. So here are the dynamics written in a mathematical notation, and these describe the development of the state variable, which we choose here to be the area in the old forest. So the objective is to maximize the discounted value of periodic utilities subject to these H-class dynamics that I just described schematically and also mathematically, plus any harvest constraints that are specified. So essentially, it's an infinite horizon problem. So we maximize the discount value of these utilities, the sum of these utilities over an infinite horizon. And like I already mentioned, this utility can be defined as the net market surplus, like it's usually done in these actual market level models. Hence, this model that we explore here is a representation of this sort of like a dynamic market equilibrium. And now to compare the two model setups, so we have here the Bellman equation. So this is how we formulate it. Instead of writing it as an infinite horizon maximization problem, which it can be done as well, we formulate this as a Bellman equation. So here we have the value function V, we have a discount factor delta, and then we have expectation operator here in this stochastic case, and then this harvest constraint. So you can harvest more from the each H class than there actually is area in each of the H class available. But this is the stochastic model. So in each period, the decision maker or the markets don't know exactly how much of the forest is being destroyed by these fires, but man has to make decisions based on this expected value, and knowing, of course, the whole distribution of the possible events. So they know the market participants know the shape of the probability density function or the shock process. Here, the same setup for the certainty equivalence case, or the deterministic case, like we call it. Here we don't have the expectation operator because it's all known. Everybody knows what share of the forest will be destroyed after the harvesting is conducted, and that's why there's no expectation operator. And this theta here, like in the previous slide, I guess I forgot to mention, this is well, it was exactly the share of the forest being destroyed. And here in the deterministic setup, we set this theta, known value of theta, to equal the expected value of the theta from the stochastic case. So we solve this model using this standard toolbox that has been developed for solving this sort of like dynamic problems. So we use collocation method to solve the value function iteration and cubic spline basis, but I'm not going to go into great details about that. Some functional forms, I already apologize for solving so many equations and math, but we define the inverse demand function to describe the demand for timber in the marketplace. So this is like a constant elasticity form. And then we also use a beta distribution to describe the shock process. So with beta distribution, there are two parameters to be chosen. And we actually end up choosing, instead of choosing these parameters, we choose the expected value that we want and the variance that we want, and then we solve for the parameters pi1 and pi2 to match this, to give the shape of the distribution that we want. So here's an example of the type of beta distribution that we use in our analysis. So here, I think the average expected value should be about 0.8. So 80% of the land will survive the next period. Okay, and of course, there's an important question now. Well, what do we mean by next period? Is it the next year or next subsequent 10 years or something like that? Well, it depends really on how we define these other parameters in the model, especially the discount factor. So here are some of the values that we chose for the parameters. So this discount factor that we chose can kind of represent different combinations of period length versus actual interest rate, that the discount rate that the market experiences. So if, for example, if the period length here is like 50 years, which could represent the case in the northern boreal forest where we have very long rotation ages or maybe 30 or 40 years is more suitable to represent the case, for example, here in the southern Finland. But so if we choose this discount factor to be 0.4, and let's say the period length is 40, then that translates to an interest rate of 2.3. So we just chose one suitable discount factor, and then let these potential cases then to represent different regions in the, or different time periods, or whatever it is that's of interest in the study. Okay, so we solved the model, and here our exciting results. So we get the policy functions. So these are the solutions. So essentially, what is a policy function? It tells the optimal level of harvest from each age class for a given amount of, or the given level of the state variable, which is the old area forest. So whatever area you have old forest, then this policy function will tell you what's the optimal amount of harvesting that you should do from the young forest or from the old forest. So this is from the deterministic model. We saw the similar kind of a policy function from the stochastic model. And well, here you can identify this type of regions from these policy functions. So there's region A, where there is harvesting occurring in both age classes. So you typically, if you harvest the entire old age class and then some part of the younger one, or then we have region B, where you don't do any harvesting from the young age class, but you only harvest the old age class. And then we have region C, where some of the old forest is actually left unharvested and for the next period. So there's also that sort of like possibility in this sort of like policy function. So then we compare now these policy functions. So here on the left side, we have the stochastic policy, certain equivalence policy. The differences between these policy functions are very small in this baseline parameter setting. We also compare the value functions that we get from these two models for the base case parameter setting, and the differences there are very small as well. You can also solve the optimal transition functions, and here on the left side we have the certain equivalence case. So these transition functions show how the state variable will develop for a given variable right now, for the given degree of the variable, the amount of forest in the old age class right now. And here, the circle here on the left side also shows the steady state. And here on the right side, we have the stochastic setting. So we have there also shown the kind of the probability distribution of these transitions. So if you have a certain amount of old forest area right now, what's the probability density distribution, or the probability distribution of this next period old age class forest areas. Okay, and there we identify the steady state. And in the paper, we actually spend quite a lot of time to characterize the steady state and properties of the steady state and the model, even without these numerical methods. But I'm not going into too much detail in this presentation. Here we've done some simulations, deterministic outcome, stochastic mean outcomes, and then one realization from the stochastic model. And these are the optimal solutions that we were able to. And there's some differences, as you can see. So the amount, for example, here the deterministic model yields a slightly larger area in the old forest class, in the older age class, than what the stochastic mean value there is. And another interesting result that we are able to show is that the cycles that are typically found in this type of models actually disappear as a result of this disturbance process. So the disturbances kind of even out and shave off the fluctuations gradually, and then there's a nice convergence. But that's maybe a more of a theoretical result than very important for applied settings. And then we have also these harvest simulations that we've conducted. So these are just model runs that we are able to do. Timber prices, we've simulated timber prices development again from both models and also for one stochastic case. And then we also compare, using the same two policy functions, but using the two policy functions with the same kind of like realization of these shocks in time to see how the actual outcomes, the optimal outcomes differ. And in our base case, they don't differ by a great degree or great extent. Okay, so some conclusions from this sort of like exercise that we did. Well, what we've kind of, in our view, established is that the policy functions from these two ways of solving the model approximate. Well, the deterministic policy function approximates the policy function of the stochastic model very closely. And we conducted a broad range of sensitivity analysis as well. And in general, this result continues to hold. So there are some outlier cases, some extreme cases where in the parameter space that we explored with the sensitivity analysis, where the differences with these two policy functions can be a bit bigger. But those are very extreme cases typically. So in our view, we can, or based on our results, the deterministic model might be adequate for solving policy functions for a stochastic world. And then also to simulate these stochastic outcomes. Some future work that when we have time, we will probably continue doing. So adding more age classes, finding realistic parameters for a specific area or region or market, age class specific shocks. So that's of course something that's, so in our model, the same shock affects all the forests. So there could be also age class specific shocks. Amenity values could be added, biodiversity values, salvage volume, those can be easily added, and regeneration costs. But of course, analyzing the model becomes then more difficult. So here is this reference if some of you are interested in actually taking a look at the paper and reading it through. Here is the citation for that, and you can also email me. I can send you the paper if you are interested in taking a look at it. And here's the literature that I cited. But okay, thank you for the time.
Okay, thanks, Olli-Pekka. Great presentation, and it's also very useful from market level modeling perspective, in the sense that if you can model these stochastic shocks as deterministic shares, then it makes their incorporation into market level analysis much easier. Again, if you have questions, please raise a hand and we'll take them. But while we're waiting for questions, I might ask one. You had the list of the things you have considered of how you could expand the model. Have you given any thought to the idea of having partial disturbances in the model? Because I mean, in such a sort of age-structured model, that's something that you can't directly incorporate into that. But is there some neat way in which you might expand the model in that direction and find the properties of how partial disturbances might affect the outcome?
Sure, yeah, that's an interesting question. So by partial disturbance, you mean that, the whole area is not destroyed by the disturbance, but, it can continue growing to the next period. Yeah, but yeah,
exactly. Maybe so it's not a stand replacing disturbance.
Yeah, exactly. It's not a stand replacing disturbance event. Yeah, that's an interesting question. Yes, I'm sure it is possible. I guess that's an optimistic modeler's answer. You can define, like I was talking about the age class specific shocks, and if you can define in a way where only only some volume will be reduced as a result of the disturbance, but then it doesn't have to return back to the original H class in the dynamic scheme of things, then yeah, maybe that could be potentially done, and it might be, of course, important model development to be done in the future.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I see that Mikko has a hand up, so Mikko, please go ahead. Mikko, you're on mute. You have to turn on your mic. I still can't hear you.
Maybe if you can write in the chat box, maybe I can answer it later.
Yeah, we can maybe take that at the end of the webinar if we have the issue sorted.
Or is it?
Oh, there's something in the chat. Oh, okay. Mikko's unmuted mic doesn't work. Mikko, have you tried pressing F4? Because in some computers there's a mute button there, and if there's a light there, then you're muted. But if that doesn't work, then okay, yeah. Okay, so maybe if Mikko, you want to type the question, and we can take it at the end of the webinar. And if there are no other questions at the moment, then we can move on to our last presenter, who is Matt Wibbenmeyer. So Matt, if you have your slides ready, please share them.
Can everyone see my slides?
Okay, yeah, I see your slides and I hear you. Okay. So great. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Apo. It's great to be here. I'm Matt Wibbenmeyer, and I'm a fellow at Resources for the Future. And for those of you that don't know us, we're a nonprofit in Washington, D.C., and our goal is to use environmental and natural resource economics to inform policy decision-making, mostly centered on policy decision-making in the US and in DC, but we do have some international work as well. I'm an economist. I work on topics related to forests and land use, and particularly on wildfire. And today I'm going to share, different from the previous presentations, I'm going to share results from 3 papers, which I'll cover fairly briefly. But before I do that, I'll provide some context on the wildfire issue in the Western US, because this is not a system that all of you live and work on. So wildfire activity in the Western US has been increasing over the past 4 or 5 decades in the Western US. And what that means is we've seen an increase in area burned on average about 6 Manhattans, or 355 square kilometers each year between 1984 and 2011. And the number of large fires has increased by about 500% from the 70s to the first decade of this century. and it's increased even more in recent years. Just taking a look at what this looks like in the Western US, these are the fires from between 1984 and 2011, and in the bar charts and trend lines on either side, you can see within ecoregions how the number of large fires has changed over this period. So in most ecoregions, we've seen an increase in the number of large fires. These fires are concentrated. Of course, Idaho, Nevada has seen a lot, but California is where we see the most damaging fires, in part because of the population there. So in addition to frequency, we've seen an increase in how severe these fires are. And so by severity, we mean the roughly the percentage of vegetation the fire consumes. And so we've seen an 8-fold increase in the area burned at high severity between 1985 and 2017. And as I mentioned, an increase in damages. So 15 of the 20 most destructive fires in California state history have occurred just since 2015, in the last 8 years. So this is a really dramatic increase in the losses from fires. And in 2018, we of course saw the Camp Fire in Paradise, California, which destroyed 18,000 structures. And this was the largest disaster in terms of insured losses in the world that year. So what are the costs of this increased fire activity? There are a number of categories of costs that we can think about and that are important to consider. Health and economic impacts due to smoke are quite significant. Costs of managing these events in terms of fighting fires and preventing their spread, et cetera. There can also be indirect economic losses due to disruption of business closures, evacuations, et cetera. And then, of course, direct property damages. So in this presentation today, I'm going to focus on direct property damages, but I do want to be clear that these are not by any means the only losses associated with wildfire events. And there's some, in some of the more recent research, I think we're learning that the health impacts of smoke emitted from fires could be as or more significant in terms of total damages as direct property damages. Nevertheless, I'm going to focus on direct property damages and how the extent of these damages and who experiences these damages we can think of as determined by a few factors. First is exposure, so who is exposed to potential losses by, for example, living in a place potentially affected by wildfires. Second, what is the hazard, or what is the probability that a fire event occurs, and how much hazard mitigation has occurred to reduce that probability. The vulnerability represents what is the potential for loss in the case of an event. And the extent of the response is a factor with wildfires as well. So how swift and forceful is the response to prevent the wildfire spread or to prevent damages to, for example, structure. So in the 3 papers that I'm going to discuss today, I'll look at equity and distributional concerns with 3 of these factors: exposure, hazard mitigation, and response. Before I move on to the papers, I'll just provide a couple of additional contextual details. So first, I want to introduce the idea of the wildland-urban interface, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So the wildland-urban interface is the area where there's at least moderate development and which is adjacent to or intermingles with large areas of vegetation. So it's important to note here that the wildland-urban interface, or WUI, is not defined, does not have wildfire as part of its definition. So if we look at this map of the United States, we do see that we have a lot of WUI area in the eastern US where wildfire does not present such a substantial threat. And in the western US, we have less wildland-urban interface area. But the WUI area that we do see in the western US, this is where there's larger potential for losses due to wildfires. And the WUI area in the US has been growing over the past several decades. It's growing at a rate of 350,000 houses per year across the US. And the expansion is being driven by amenity migration, so people moving to places where they can be by the forest, and it can also be driven by high housing costs near urban cores, which is driving people further away and into outlying areas where there may be some wildfire hazard, particularly in the western US. And so this increase in WUI area can result in increased management costs and also increased damages. The second piece of context I want to introduce here is the particularly important role of federal lands in the western US. And so this is a map of the 11 western contiguous US states. And the federal lands, that is lands owned and managed by the US federal government and its various land management agencies within it. And 50% of all land in western US states is owned by the US federal government. And an even greater share of the overall land burned in wildfires tends to be on federal lands, and that's because wildlands are disproportionately federal lands. As a result, the federal government has a really important role to play in hazard mitigation with respect to wildfires, and then also fighting wildfires which occur throughout the federal lands. So some of what I'll talk about today is related to how the federal government sort of executes that role of managing lands and responding to fires. So the three topics I'll discuss are some papers on distribution of hazard, distribution of federal hazard reduction projects, which can reduce the hazard that individual households face. And here I'm talking about fuel treatments, so things like prescribed burns or mechanical thinning projects, which both work to reduce some of the fuels that contribute to wildfire risk in the western US. And then the third paper on distribution of fire suppression effort, so essentially how a firefighting effort is distributed across communities. So I'll begin with this paper on distributional incidence of wildfire hazard in the western US. And this is a paper that is with Molly Robertson, who's a research associate at RFF. And the question we're asking in this paper is, how is hazard distributed across demographic and income groups in the western US? So we bring together three sources of data on wildfire hazard, and here we're using a measure from the U.S. Forest Service. The measure is wildfire hazard potential, and it essentially describes the potential for a large fire that would be difficult to contain on any given point across the landscape. So it's a wall-to-wall data set. We combine that with US Census data, which gives us various demographic variables, and then data from the Zillow Z-Trax program, which provides property coordinates and assessed property values for the universe of properties across the Western US. And with this, we analyze how wildfire hazard is distributed across households in the Western US. So on the left, you can see a figure that compares the distribution of property values in low fire hazard households and high fire hazard households. Here, low fire hazard is defined as wildfire hazard potential equal to 0, and high fire hazard is wildfire hazard potential above the 95th percentile of wildfire hazard among all households in the Western US. And what you can see is that looking at these two distributions, the bars show the median property values in each group, and the median property value in high fire hazard households is about $17,000 higher than the median property value in low fire hazard households, though the distributions, of course, do overlap quite a bit. The other thing you can see is that the left tail of the distribution of property value in high fire hazard households is a bit wider. And so what this indicates is that conditional on being in a high fire hazard household, it is more likely that the property value of the home will be very low. So we see that in high fire hazard areas, they're higher value homes on average, but they also have a disproportionate number of very low value homes as well. On the right-hand side of this figure, we have a table summarizing demographic characteristics, comparing low hazard areas to high hazard areas. Here showing high hazard defined as being above the 90th percentile of wildfire hazard, though in the paper we do this a number of ways. And what we find is that in high hazard areas, per capita income is higher, residents are less likely to be above the poverty line, more likely to be white, and more likely to be older. Residents of high hazard areas are also more likely to be Native American on average. Oh, shoot, this, apologies, I exported this from PowerPoint and my nice animation, of course, disappeared. So I did not account for that. I think you can, actually, you know what? Maybe I'm going to just switch to PowerPoint because I think I can do that because I want you to all see that slide. So I'll just take a moment. Can you all again see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Apologies for that.
Great. Yeah.
So this slide shows the geographic, the distributional incidence of fire hazard geographically. So this is a somewhat complicated figure, so I'm going to step through this kind of slowly. So in this figure, we've divided the Western US into hexagonal grid cells. Each grid cell is colored according to the property value decile of the median home facing wildfire hazard in that cell. So if a cell is dark in color, the median home in that cell is very low in value. If the cell is lighter colored, the median home facing fire hazard in that cell is very high in value. The cell's height is representing the number of homes in that cell that are facing wildfire hazard. So a bar that's very high, a cell that's very high, has a lot of homes facing fire hazard. A cell that's very low has very few. On the right, we have some bars, some bar charts that tell us the number of grid cells in each home value decile and the number of properties per grid cell. So looking at that first bar chart, this is showing the number of total grid cells in the figure to the left that are in each home value decile. So where the median home facing fire hazard in that cell is with respect to each of these deciles. And you can see that there's a lot more grid cells that are dark in color as compared to grid cells that are lighter in color, where the median property is higher in value. So what this is saying is that overall across the Western US, more of the area where there's fire hazard has kind of low value properties. This is sort of seems like it might contradict the message of the previous slide, but if we look at the figure to the just the last bar chart, this shows the number of properties per grid cell, and the grid cells where the typical property facing high fire hazard is higher in value, those grid cells tend to have a lot more properties. So this is how we can see this result above. The total area of the Western Western US facing high fire hazard areas tends to have low property values, but on average, properties facing fire hazard tend to be higher in value because the areas where the median property value is higher tend to be denser. The second paper I'll tell you about is a paper on the distribution of hazard mitigation benefits. And so in this paper, our question is, are federal hazard mitigation projects allocated equitably across high and low SES communities? Here, SES is socioeconomic status. So here we're using data on fuel treatment. Again, that's prescribed burns and mechanical thinning projects, and their locations between 2003 and 2011. This comes from a US Forest Service and US Department of Interior reporting database. We're combining this with census data and data from the Forest Service, again, on fire hazard potential. So what we do in this paper is estimate the likelihood that a community is to have a fire hazard fuels project placed nearby as a function of its fire risk, and then also a series of socioeconomic status measures. We then predict the probability that each community will receive a treatment as a function of the risk and the SES measure. And we plot these for communities where the SES measure is very high and very low. So here, high is 2 standard deviations above the mean, and low is 2 standard deviations below the mean. And how you should interpret these figures is looking across the x-axis, we see the wildfire hazard potential octiles increasing from low risk to high risk. And what we see is that the probability that a community receives a fuel treatment increases as risk climbs from low to high. This is, of course, what we would expect to see. Fuel treatments are being placed in more risky locations. But we also see that in higher SES communities, fuel treatments are more likely to be located nearby, even if that community is within the same wildfire hazard potential octile as a low risk community. So within the same wildfire hazard potential octile, higher SES communities are more likely to receive fuel treatments. And this holds across SES measures with sort of the exception of proportion above the poverty line, which is the upper right figure. So part of this could be explained by differences in density. We do control for density in these models, but that could be part of the story, what's going on here. Another part of the story could be that higher SES communities are better at and more successful in asking for these projects to be located nearby. And in fact, we have a paper, and I should have said this is a paper with Sarah Anderson and Andrew Plantinga at UC Santa Barbara. And we have another paper in addition to the one from this figure on the right, which indicates that when attention to wildfire risk is high within a community, i.e. after a wildfire event has recently occurred in the area, probability of treatment increases nearby communities, but it increases most near high SES communities, which is consistent with a story in which communities that are better off, are better able to lobby agencies and are more successful in lobbying agencies to have fuel treatments placed nearby. The final paper I'll discuss is a paper on benefits from wildfire suppression. And this is a paper with Andrew Plantinga at UC Santa Barbara and Randy Walsh at University of Pittsburgh. And here the question we're asking is wildfire suppression evenly distributed across communities? So here we're using data from 1,400 wildfires between 1999 and 2015. We use the data on the wildfire perimeters as well as the ignition locations. And we combine that with a variety of data meant to represent values at risk across the landscape surrounding each fire ignition location. So this data comes from the US Census, from CoreLogic property assessors data, and a variety of other sources. As well, we have data on recreation sites, critical watersheds, endangered species habitat, a variety of other features on the landscape. And then last, we combine this with data on wildfire spread. And here we're using simulated wildfire spread variables that come from a US Forest Service fire simulation model. So what do we do with these data? Well, we use these fire ignition locations and we divide the landscape around each fire ignition point into a series of 24 directions of spread. And then using the fire perimeters we're able to see within each of these directions of spread, how far did the fire burn? And then we model the probability the fire will have stopped or would have stopped burning within each of these directions of spread as a function of assets at risk in each of those directions. And this, and as well, we control for these fire spread variables because, of course, the things that affect those fire spread variables, like landscape characteristics and vegetation, could be correlated with some of those assets at risk, like homes. And we want to isolate what is the effect of the presence of those homes on the likelihood the fire will stop spreading. And this allows us to say something about what was the fire suppression effort on behalf of those assets. So what we find is that fire is more likely to stop spreading as it approaches areas with greater number of homes and higher value of homes. But value of homes matters more. And so this result is summarized in this table here. And if you look at scenario one shows what happens to the probability the fire stops spreading as we increase the housing assets in that cell from a completely unpopulated cell to the mean of the number of residential properties and the value of residential properties within that cell. And so what happens when we go from an unpopulated cell to a sort of cell populated at the average levels is that the probability the fire stops spreading increases by about 6 percentage points. In scenario two, we do a few policy experiments where first, in scenario 2A, we double the average property value of properties in that cell. So that properties go from $200,000 on average to $400,000 on average. And according to the estimates from our model, we see that the probability the fire stops spreading increases by an additional 3 percentage points. If, on the other hand, we double the number of residential properties rather than doubling the value of those properties, we get an increase of only about 1/10 of 1 percentage point from the baseline of a 6 percentage point increase. And this is even though this results in an equivalent increase in the total value of residential properties as scenario 2A. So what we see is that increasing the average value of homes matters quite a bit more than increasing the total number of homes. So some conclusions from these papers. So first, households facing high fire hazard are more likely to live in high value homes, to be higher income, and to be more likely to be white. Though it's important to note that high fire hazard areas are highly heterogeneous. High income households are also more likely to benefit from fuel treatment projects and from fire suppression effort. And so policies that shift resources from low hazard to high hazard areas, and here I'm thinking about, for example, insurance pools in which those living in high fire hazard areas aren't paying premiums that truly reflect risk, or policies in which fire suppression effort is covered from the general general fund. Those policies shift resources from low hazard. Those policies are possibly regressive. So an increased burden for high-income households in WUI areas may be justified and could actually have a beneficial effect of further disincentivizing further development in high fire hazard areas. This said, though, we need to be careful if such policies were implemented that were not harming disadvantaged communities, of which there are also many in high fire hazard areas. So there may be a need for a geographically targeted approach focused on reducing burden for vulnerable communities. So with that, I'll thank you for your attention and happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Matt, for a great presentation. It was a very neat package of 3 different papers linked together by variations of the same theme. So again, we have the same thing as earlier. If you have a question, please raise your hand. But while we're waiting for other questions, I have one question about the links between the first and the second paper. And I think you might have addressed this, but I could have missed it. So in the second paper, you showed that you have you're going to probably get a higher hazard mitigation treatment in areas with higher socioeconomic status. And in the first, but you said, but in the first paper, then you showed that there are these sort of very dense clusters of high value properties. And then there are these large areas of low density, low value properties. So, and one of the things you mentioned there was that this could probably affect your conclusions on the effect of the socioeconomic status. So I was wondering, how did you control for potential effects there, or can you elaborate a bit more on that, because that's something I perhaps missed?
Yeah. So in the model in the second paper, we're estimating a linear probability model looking at the probability a community receives a fuel treatment nearby, and we estimate that as a function of fire hazard, interactions of the SES variable with fire hazard, and then a density control. And I think the question is whether the linear density control is enough, or whether there could be interactions between density and wildfire hazard that we need to control for. And I think that's something that we could consider a little bit more.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Olli-Pekka has a hand up, so I think I'll give the turn to Olli-Pekka if you want to ask something.
Yes, thanks, Matt, for a very interesting presentation. Yeah, I remember seeing some neat video case stories of these more affluent communities that were able to, I think, secure some sort of a cost share funding from the federal government to be able to conduct these sort of field treatment projects, or maybe it was state funded. I can't remember now for sure. So maybe that's one I guess key question of how you can extend this sort of a know-how how to apply these essentially subsidies to conduct these field treatments even in the I guess if I can call them lower income communities. That's I guess one observation. And then the other thing that I was wondering is that, of course, when it comes to firefighting, one important question or aspect of the incident or the terrain is that how well the space is defensible. So is it safely defensible? So my guess is that maybe in the more affluent communities, since the treatments have been conducted, or maybe it's just like there's some fire breaks like roads, or I don't know what it could be, but maybe that makes it then safer for firefighters to prevent the spread of fire, or fight the fires. Whereas if the forests haven't been maintained, then it's more dangerous, and as a result, they won't even try risk it and try to fight the fire. I don't know if these observations make sense.
Yes, they absolutely do. Those are both great. Those are both great comments. So on your first comment about cost share programs, so yeah, that's absolutely something that we thought about. And actually, in the paper that I was highlighting there's sort of two analyses, and the second analysis focuses on this cost share question, whether cost share programs may be a potential mechanism for driving inequality in fuel treatments. So an example of that kind of program is the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, which is a federal program in the US, where communities can band together, offer up some funds to do forest restoration work, and that those funds will be matched by the federal government, and they can do more work across the landscape at a landscape scale. Actually, what we found is there's sort of no differences in terms of the demographics of communities that receive those CFLRP funds versus those that don't. So at least in that analysis that we've done so far, we haven't found that that's a driving force. We were actually a little bit surprised by that, but this is something that we've been talking to some folks at the Forest Service about to try to understand that a bit better. So that's ongoing. On your second point on defensible space, so that's a really good point too. One of the nice features about how we structured this analysis is that so we're looking at overall wildfire perimeters, not at home like structure losses. Defensible space would have a really pretty important role in influencing whether a structure is lost or not, but it's going to have less of an impact on the overall shape of the wildfire perimeter. And so we think that sort of helps us get around that concern that, well, maybe wealthier households are just doing a better job in terms of defensible space, or in some cases they can even contract with insurance companies to have private firefighters come and protect their homes. But again, that's going to impact the probability of a specific structure loss, but we don't think it should impact the overall shape of the fire perimeter quite as much.
Okay, thank you. I was reminded that we are running over time, so I think I'll have to wrap up. Thanks again for all the 3 great presentations today. And a last reminder for everyone working on boreal forests, the IBFRA conference call for abstracts is still open till the end of January, so do check that out. But yeah, so thank you.